So next up, we have an interesting talk from Tony of Red Canary, who's going to be talking about the wild world of installers and all the really interesting things that go on there. So let's give Tony a round of applause.
My name is Tony Lambert. I'm from Red Canary. We do a lot of endpoint security monitoring, and we happen to monitor a lot of macOS systems. So I wanted to kind of talk through something that I feel like is kind of assumed knowledge and make it explicit knowledge. That's something I've kind of been, a trend I've been kind of doing a little bit of work nowadays where, for every one or two of us that understands how installers work on macOS, there are hundreds of blue team folks working in enterprises that have no idea how it works, have no idea how where you can stash code and everything. So that's kind of where this talk got started. A little bit about me. I'm a senior malware analyst at Red Canary. I tear apart malware. I do it on all platforms. I happen to focus a little bit more on Mac some days than others. Always have to include something a little bit fun, so my wife and I have an adopted greyhound at home, a retired racer. If you're ever looking, this is the dog tax for the day. So if you're ever looking for a good apartment pet, you're ever looking to give an animal a good home, absolutely go for some retired racers. They're looking for good homes. So today, the big thing I wanted to talk through with installers is a few different categories. Wanted to talk about package-based installers, PKGs, DMG-based installers, everybody just double-click and drag over those, and then developer libraries, because we end up having a lot of folks that talk to us that are really interested in either supply chain compromise type stuff, or we have a lot of customers, a lot of folks in the community that talk to us who are development shops that run macOS. So these development shops are going to have developer libraries, they're going to have all sorts of third-party stuff in their projects that they need to keep track of. So starting out, I really wanted to do a little bit of deliberate talk about what really is an installer. If you're coming to this from a Windows platform, we're going to talk about an installer is going to be anything that makes executable code written to disk. There's no such thing as immaculate compilation. Code doesn't spring from nothing. It just has to be put there somehow. So an installer is going to be anything that writes executable code to disk. It's going to lay down some sort of settings, and it may do network connections to get more executable code. If we're talking about this from a Windows platform, this is going to be stuff that is installed to program files. We're going to have registry settings, network connections to go get more DLLs, things like that. The same concepts apply to macOS, but the artifacts are different. So instead of the Windows registry, you've gotplists and config files. Instead of DLLs, you'll have dilibs. You'll still have your network connections to go get more stuff. There's that little bit of just fine idiosyncrasy differences. And when we start talking through this definition of anything that lays down more executable code and settings, when we talk about that deliberately, there's not a lot of difference between malware and an installer. The difference is really you trust an installer, or you're led to believe that you should trust an installer, and whereas malware, who knows. First big one to talk about would be packages. So if we're kind of talking through analogs with Windows, other platforms, so package installers are a little bit more like MSIs, a little bit more like RPM packages, things like that you might see on other platforms. If you're used to seeing on Windows setup.exe or something like that, it doesn't precisely work in the same way. So in the case of package files, these are XAR compressed archives. Inside, they have some gzip components that are compressed together. They're really easy to break apart in Linux a lot of times. If you are lucky enough to have a Mac VM, something that's working well for you, you can do a package util, I believe, and break those apart. But hey, if you're working from Remnix or another malware analysis distro, you can pretty easily use gunzip to pull those apart. And during the installation, they support scripting. There's a few different places that you can stash code. And the processes that are involved, like we were talking about, are a little bit different. Like on Windows, you might have like a setup.exe or an MSI exec or something like that. On Linux, it's going to be like Python running yum, running DNF or whatever else that's installing your package. But on Mac, there's a few different processes specifically targeted towards installation. So the first big one is going to be installer with a little I, the lowercase I. I have to say that because there's like 2 installers. This is going to be something that you see more from the command line. So if you're deploying packages via Jamf or another client management tool, you're probably going to see this a lot in your environment. You're going to expect, these are the files that are coming out of a package archive itself. So you might see like the file modifications from installer include pre-install, post-install scripts, bill of materials, things like that coming out. So uppercase installer from installer.app, this is going to be more of the GUI version of this. So you start and you double click on the package, and round about then the installer.app process is going to start popping up. And it's going to spawn off of launchd. So it's a little bit of a weird thing for Windows people to experience. So if we're going from like the Windows side of life, you might see setup.exe spawning off of Windows Explorer or something like that. That is an entire world away from like your blue team going, wait a minute, installer spawned from launchd, what is this mess? And so they then have to track back and see, what else happened along that timeline. And the same as with lowercase I installer, just unpacks everything, and depending on the size of your package, you may have loads of files, you may have very little files. And the final one that I wanted to talk about with the installation processes is install-d. Kind of, with Saba talking about having like predetermined spaces, predetermined folders in the installation being bad. So install-d is going to be this component that takes all of the content, all of the payload content from a package and shove it into a sandbox folder. Sandbox folder is going to have a semi-randomized path. It's going to be something that, it's not a predeterministic folder path, so you can't really shove as many like symbolic links, something like that, to mess with the installation. There are typically thousands upon thousands of file modifications, and then afterwards, once everything is laid down to disk, install-d then calls a shove process to merge that installation with a file system. So if you've ever used BlockBlock and you have noticed, hey, I get a lot of notifications that shove is managing my launch agents. This is why. So this is actually the little bit of the process where that happens. All right, so the fun part, where can we actually stash code? So there's a few different places, and the first one I wanted to cover, or 2 different places. First one I wanted to cover were the actual scripts inside package archives. And this is something that we absolutely see adversaries using on a weekly basis, pretty much. So first of all, we have pre-install and post-install scripts. They're exactly what they sound like. If you're launching a package file, pre-install happens before, post-install happens after. They both have to exit with a 0 return code, or else the installation fails. And bad guys really get into this. The adversaries really figure out how to use this to their advantage. Most of the time with the process hierarchy, we see it coming off of a package script service process or installer. It depends, like if you've double-clicked on the package or if it's coming from Jamf or something else where you're doing client management. The scripts, when you start looking through the documentation, a lot of the documentation is written with the assumption that you're making these as shell scripts. So let's say you've got a bunch of copy commands, CP commands that you want to run. You can absolutely do that with pre-install and post-install, but you can really use anything that has like a shebang in the script. So if you want to use Python, you can use Python. If you want to use Perl and you enjoy like compiled output from a 96K modem, you can use Perl. And you can even use like binary executables if you want. And kind of including a couple of screenshots here. So the one on top was an example of something that we see in the wild where if you use the specialized Jamf installer packages for viscosity, they actually have pre-install and post-install binaries instead of scripts in their packaging. And then for another one towards the bottom, we have shell scripts. And then on top, we have more Python, and then at the bottom, iMovie lets you use Perl to do its scripting abilities in there. So then we have to kind of figure out, like, how does the package know to do the pre-install, post-install thing? Does it automatically assume, not all packages have a pre-install, post-install? All of that is governed by a package info file that's found within the package. On the left-hand side here, I've got a kind of tree view of a package. Shout out to the Zoom people. Thank you for not being mad at me, like including a tree view of your packages here. By the way, these were absolutely not malicious. Good, 100%. Good job, guys. And yeah, there we go. Doing your jobs, yeah. So we have in our payloads here, we have like the Zoom US application bundle, then we have pre-install, post-install scripts. And if we look into the package info file, we have pre-install and post-install. So the pre-install for Zoom is going to say, hey, do we have any previous versions of Zoom on this host? If we do, maybe we'll want to upgrade, let's do some prep. And then post-install says, hey, let's clean up everything now that we're done. At some point or another, adversaries figured out that there was this neat little thing where you can make payload-free packages. Sometimes, they don't really need to include their malware inside a package. What if they just want the scripts? Admins sometimes do this too. This is a really simple way for you to use something like Jamf, to use something that lets you distribute packages and just do scripting content, like somehow like you might send like batch scripts or PowerShell scripts on the Windows side, just send that over on macOS instead of enabling SSH and doing that way. So in those cases, all the work for an installation is offloaded entirely away from the actual install-D, all of that stuff, and put over into the work coming off of the script. So we're going to see a lot of curl commands, copy commands, zips, dittos, all sorts of things like that, where it's unpackaging things. And when you start looking into the package info file will literally show you 0 bytes for a payload. So you can actually have evidence there while you're doing analysis. There is nothing in this package at all. It's literally just scripts. So it's all cool. This isn't stunt hacking. This is literally something that happens in the wild here. So let's talk about how this actually happens. So in the first case with Apple Juice, the alleged, suspected North Korean malware, however we want to put it, they used pre-install and post-install scripts during their installation of fake cryptocurrency malware or fake cryptocurrency tracking things. So those absolutely laid down launch agents. They laid down persistence for that malware to happen. There's another, yeah, there we go. There's another activity cluster that we track at Red Canary called Silver Toucan. If you pay attention to Confiant, some of the others, they'll track it also as Wizard Update, I believe. This family will, the malware that's in this activity cluster will start using pre-install and post-install scripts. Instead of including content, they'll just download everything. Their pre-install says, hey, what version am I? What version do I need to download? Figures out even what country you're in. And then the post-install does all of the downloading, all of the unzipping and unpackaging and persistence for you. So in this case, they don't even have to update a package with a new version. They can literally just redistribute the same package over and over and over and only update the stuff that's on their server sides. By the way, this is also in C2 frameworks. So if you want to be a little bit dangerous when you get home, you can go and take a look at Empire and you can look at Mystical. So at the top, and Mystical is a project that lets you sort of wedge Mythic and AppFell agents into installers into a little bit more of a dangerous form that you can work with. So at the top left is literally the template that Empire uses. Top right is the template that Mystical uses for most of its pre-install, post-install scripts. And then if you really want to get fancy, the simple installer that actually lays down files in Mystical is the one that gets used on bottom. So Finally, the last little bit of the package, we want to talk about a distribution XML file. So in distribution XML, this is typically a file that Apple said it defines the installation experience for an installer. It's supposed to have things like installation checks, versioning, all this different stuff in it. However, somebody at some point said, you know what, let's wedge JavaScript in there. Don't really know why, but hey, it works. Usually it's for things like system checks, figuring out, is my version of Mac capable with this? Do I have like this space on the file system, things like that. However, at some point somebody said, let's let you run system commands. There's a system.run command from the JavaScript API, and if you're going through and you're double clicking on a package and this distribution XML has a system.run command in it, it will spawn off of installer with the uppercase I. And in the documentation, hopefully it's pretty visible, but the documentation explicitly says launches a given program from the resources directory. What they kind of omit is it doesn't have to be in the resources directory. It can be in whatever directory you want it to be. And the best part about it is it executes as root. So get all that going. So in the activity cluster that we tracked is Silver Sparrow from earlier in the year. The malware family in Silver Sparrow used that to essentially run commands as root coming straight off of this installer. There were no pre-install, post-install scripts in the malware. It was all just wedged in the distribution file. So a little bit of detection advice around this. So you're definitely not going to hear me say like the $5 security advice, look for launch agents. No, all right. This is going to be like the little weird thing where if you have a SOC, if you have monitoring, it's going to be a little bit more difficult for you to dial in on some of this. So if you're going to do threat hunts, you might want to look for suspicious processes coming off of installer with capital I, lowercase I, or package script service. If you're targeting specifically threat hunts for pre-install or post-install, look for those things in the command line. Look for those strings in the command line. So they can be, again, any kinds of scripts. So you can't assume that this is going to be a shell script. There's a possibility, maybe you're also looking for Python or Perl or whatever else. As for what to expect, if you're doing this in like a continuous monitoring environment, there's going to be a lot of weird noise and not a lot of really good signal because people make arbitrary, very strange design decisions. There's not really one solid standard of here is how you should create a package file. And as a result of that, everybody kind of does this arbitrary sort of dance where they do it their own way. And then because by virtue of scripting being involved as well as some of Apple's built-in stuff, who knows what the package is actually going to do or needs to do. There's even a possibility like, hey, this may look evil as heck, but at the end of the day, it's really real. All right, so DMGs. If you're coming to this from the Windows side of life, think of DMGs as like VHD files. These are essentially virtual removable disks. They contain their own file systems, and for better or for worse, they kind of get managed like removable media. Just think like virtually mounting an ISO, mounting a VHD, something like that. And kind of used to this sort of thing where you take one application bundle, drag and drop over to applications and let it run. So what does it look like on the inside? On the inside, when you start looking at these, there's usually like a fairly common structure. There's usually an application bundle of some sort. So if we're talking through like the gatekeeper bypass stuff like Patrick, Cedric, and Jaron talked about, that was an application bundle that had like a number in it, something like that. That was distributed via DMG. And then also inside there, usually there's an application symbolic link or something like that, background image to make it look fancy. So the symbolic links are what enables you to do that little drag and drop magic. So when you have the applications folder over on the right side, drag and drop over, boom, appears in /applications. All of that is fairly common to see. So what's a little bit more malicious is like, at this point, you have to really focus on what makes a malicious application bundle. So if you're going after installations via DMGs, if it runs on your hard drive, if it runs in an app bundle, it's probably going to also run from a DMG since it's just another disk. Most of the time, if you're looking at manipulation of DMGs, there's going to have to be an HDI-util attach command. So if you're starting to, go after hunts specifically for DMG installers, take a look at when HDI-util commands start running around. You'll be able to see when things are mounted. Again, malware can include whatever they want. As long as it works in an app bundle, you can make it work on a DMG. You can typically make the DMGs mount wherever you want them to. However, by default, it seems like they pretty much show up under root volumes. So what we end up seeing a lot, it's on a couple of slides forward, but what we end up seeing a lot are things like /volumes, /installer.app, or /player.app, or something like that. If somebody ever asks you to download player.app or player.dmg, just run in the other direction. As for adversary use, we end up seeing this a lot, most commonly, most predominantly from Schleyer and Bundlor. And if you're able to tell these malware families apart, you probably have a pretty good grasp on this anyways. And another good example would be the Zuru family that was recently documented. For detection, what we end up focusing in on a lot of is looking for suspicious folders under volumes. If you're going to be double-clicking on a DMG, making it run, it's probably going to show up there. So look for things that's labeled installer or player, something that makes you think, all right, cool, this maybe shouldn't be here. Flash player is almost predominantly what we see as kind of a masqueraded premise for being there, like download Schleyer, it's really Flash player. No. And then finally, I wanted to talk about third-party libraries. So with developer libraries, so this isn't as much as there's no bugs, there's no CVEs in here. This is all pretty much functionality as intended. But I really wanted to cover it because there's a kind of an idea that, people don't let people curl to bash, something like that, but running pip install is okay. So running, bundle install is okay, even though it pretty much does the same thing. So with developer libraries, these are going to be anything that's pre-canned code to do things that you don't want to program yourself. So if you want to make sure, if you want to do HTTP requests in Python, don't have to figure out how to do it yourself, just use the request library. You can't really get away from them. It's sort of it's pretty much a requirement nowadays, and they're controlled by third parties. So this is one of those things of all right, I have to use code that somebody else has developed. I have to trust them. The question is, when does that trust kind of come off the rails a little bit? There have been instances where packages have been poisoned and put into typo squatted entries in the package registry or things like that. So I want to include the meme of the day. And when we start talking about some of this, it's really easy to kind of see all of the behavior from a package installation really blend in because every package is a little bit different. Every package, if you're using CAPA from FireEye for malware analysis, it does a little bit of setup beforehand, and then if you do requests or you do whatever else package, everyone has its own kind of initialization sequence, whatever. So the things that we really want to dial in on as being suspicious are going to be anything with persistence, anything that goes and grabs additional code. For example, if you're downloading something from the pip registry in Python or from a gem registry, you really don't want it doing additional curls outside of that registry because that's something that the maintainers of the registry may not check, may not know about. And then executing additional scripts. So most of the time, the executing additional scripts part, it can be legitimate, but if you start combining that with persistence and downloads, you can start including a lot of code execution possibilities running as privileged users. And kind of where I go with this, looking at from the privileged user's perspective, this is the sort of thing you might find running on a Jenkins instance, on continuous integration systems. This isn't just, just your developer. This can also be server infrastructure. For this, I wanted to pick realistic examples for Python packages, Ruby gems, and NPM packages. All three of these families have had problems in the last 2 or 3 years. Not necessarily on macOS systems. They've had problems on Windows primarily, but there is literally nothing preventing you from creating malicious packages for each of these on macOS. All of them kind of, shoving aside the stunt hacking type stuff, this is literally something that has been documented in the news. First one, talking through Python pip. If you've ever used pip or pip3 commands to install something, you've used this package registry. All of them have a setup.py file inside its package. Structure usually looks something like this. Over on the left-hand side, setup.py. It's literally the only code that we need in there. We don't have to have like an entire code library. We don't have to have anything else. All we really need is just this bare bones structure and an os.system command, and we can get code execution. And kind of know, all right, cool, this is built into Python. Yes, it is. Where it becomes, starts getting interesting is how do we apply this in practicality? So this is going to be like, let's say that your developers have started using private repositories. They've started using private things from other people's GitHub repositories, code that your company doesn't control. This sort of thing can easily jump in. And kind of looking through the detection, something that we've tried to implement, try to look through, looking for child processes coming off of this can get a little bit weird because, it depends on the particular library. There may be additional chmod processes coming off to allow execution of code, things like that. So what we've ended up doing is looking for things that have setup.py in their Python CLIs. So whenever you do a pip install, that's really a Python pip install, and has setup tools in the command line. And we'll end up looking for things that write persistence mechanisms the most. So typically with pip, with other things, they're not going to be writing these persistence mechanisms like launch agents, launch daemons, or manipulating your shell profiles. So there's really no need. Every time you build your app, you're going to probably be doing a pip update, something like that, and that's really all it needs. It doesn't have to talk to anything else. The second one to kind of cover was Ruby gems. A lot of people are fans of Ruby on Rails. I know some folks in my org that have Ruby very close to their hearts. So we end up using bundle install sometimes to start looking through and downloading gems. I know there are a couple of other ways to work gems into the environment, but the one we see the most is bundle install. And whenever you start creating these bundles like they have, or these gems, they typically have a lot of files in their scaffold. There's just a bunch of things that get generated right off, but the one we want to focus in on is something called version.rb. So there were too many files in the tree for me to actually demonstrate, for me to actually show here without it getting like really, really hairy. So what I really wanted to focus in on was the gemloader.gemspec file. So inside that file, there's a lot of metadata saying, hey, my package is named this, my version name is this, all the different things like that. So it turns out that inside that metadata, when it goes to retrieve its version, it executes whatever's in a version.rb file. So we have seen this in the wild where, some malicious folks over on the Windows side included system commands inside a version.rb file so they could execute a rat whenever you downloaded a Ruby gem. When we start taking a look at the detection side of it, so you can do like a system command. So this is going to be the equivalent of an sh-c. So anything that you put into a shell command there, a system command there, will show up immediately as a child process. For us, we'll end up looking for some bundle installs. Again, since it's all built into Ruby, this is going to be Ruby with the process name, bundle install with a command line, and looking for more persistence mechanisms. And the last one to cover is Node.js. This one was the one that scared me a little bit because it is by far the easiest one to poison. Inside Node.js packages, usually there's just a package.json file, and that is mostly all you need. There's usually a script section in there as well. So this is the entire structure that you would need in a simple poisoned npm package file. So if you want to get really fancy, there's a script section about midway down that has a pre-install. You can put a pre-install or a post-install command there, and you can put whatever shell commands that you want. So if it executes in bash, you can put it in there. So initially when I started testing, I started using like touch commands so that I could see that I could generate files, right? So you can do that. Some adversaries have done that. But if you want to get a little bit more stealthy, if you want to get a little bit more slick with this, you can include an additional file, like in my case, I included lib.js here. And whatever you put in lib.js, if you call node immediately during the pre-install, it will execute anything that's in that lib.js. It doesn't have to be anything related to legitimate package things. It's all you would have to do is literally npm install. Anything that is defined at that main gets run, and then compromise, go on from there. Again, detection, look for node with npm install in the command lines, and we're going to be looking for persistence mechanisms coming off of them most often. So, it's pretty much what I've got, and I want to open a Q&A if I've still got time. Sweet, I've got time. So I ran through it probably a little bit fast. The last thing I wanted to thank was Leo Pitt, Doomfist. So if talked about Mystical a little bit earlier. If you want to get a little bit dangerous in your own environment and you want to test some of these things with the developer library packages out, if you want to do it like if you want to be slightly more dangerous than popping calc but less dangerous than getting malware, you can go and take a look at Mystical and do some app-felled mythic detections on this in your own environment. Sweet. What questions can I answer? Yes, sir.
Yes, real quick, while you're explaining about installers, just came to my mind, if you know a way for you to figure out the files that were dropped after the fact, like you run an installer, is there a way to, find all the files that were installed from it or something like that?
So, all right, so the question is, if we know that an installation has happened, is there a way for us to track the files after the fact? So I believe that's supposed to be the purpose of a receipt for in the middle of the installation. I'm not entirely sure, like tracking down all of the files, but it is possible to do installations in a way that don't leave a receipt either. So there are ways that you could potentially do an installation, for example, with your pre-install, post-install scripts. There is nothing that says that pre-install script, post-install script has to document what it has left.
Downloading stuff and just unzipping there.
Essentially. Yeah, it would be downloading things arbitrarily and unzipping them. So even if that package does leave a receipt, leave like a catalog list of things that get dropped, there's nothing that says the pre-install, post-install has to honor that. So I saw your hand next, Patrick.
Yeah, I was gonna wonder if you could just briefly talk to how Apple is kind of addressing malicious installers, right, doing some utilization stuff, and how if you see malware authors responding to that as well, kind of like that evolution, the back and forth.
So the question is a little bit about how we see Apple kind of responding to the back and forth of malware authors using some of this. What we really see most often is the same sort of techniques popping up with new code signatures, and then it kind of gets whack-a-mole with, all right, cool, new thing that's notarized. It pops up in the news. By the way, yesterday Apple also revoked that the certificate, so by the time it hits the news cycle, it's already been 24 hours out of notarization, something like that. That's usually what we see the most. The problematic part is that adversaries keep getting code signing certificates. Not really sure how it happens. Like I've heard some things about like, where they're kind of marketed around in illicit ways, but somehow they still get them. And right now it's kind of a whack-a-mole thing. And I'm kind of interested to see if they can institute more controls around it. Like, I really don't know how, because it's one of these things where if you're doing packages, you have to figure out a way to give people the tools they need to do their work while also getting out of the way, and then also prevent people like, you know, adware people from going and deciding like, hey, let's just mess everything up. So, no problem. Yes, ma'am. Ah, I like this. All right. The question was, do we have any advice on how to filter out Adobe packages, because Adobe packages will end up looking a lot like malware sometimes. All right, so if you're looking specifically like for Adobe things, I would specifically say like, all right, if you're looking specifically for Adobe things, do not trust any packages or DMGs that don't have signing from Adobe. That is specifically it. If we're going after like branding logos, some of these adware folks will end up using the same branding, same logos, or they'll use things that look extremely like it, but a few pixels off, something like that, to sort of say, you know, we're technically legally protected. But if you're just telling people only look for a Flash logo, they're going to be fooled by that every time. So the big thing is going to be just specifically look for the code signing things for Adobe Ink. I think that's it.